On.
Welcome and thank you very much for joining us. Yesterday, we saw history in the making when Taliban entered Kabul again after everyone thought that they were defeated in the 2001 war. Now, trying to understand how we went from 2001 and the apparent victory against the Taliban to yesterday's and today's scenes where we see people rushing in horror, trying to leave the country. We have with us Elan Journo. Elan is a fellow in the Ayn Rand Institute. He has written a lot about issues related to Islamic fundamentalism, to the Middle East. He has written the book, What Justice Demands, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and other books that I have them on electronic copy, but I would definitely suggest for this topic, Winning the Unwinnable War, America's Self-Crippled Response to Islamic Totalitarianism, which was edited by Elan. And also we have Mark, and together we're going to try to figure out what happened and why we witnessed these shocking scenes. Just a clarification for our audience, we have Elan only for 25 minutes. So on Clubhouse, after, it's going to be me and Mark. So this is going to be a slightly shorter episode. So let me start with the first question, Elan. So first of all, thank you so much for being with us. So did we achieve the goal of 2001? Because the goal was not to democratize Afghanistan. The goal was not to have them, quote, be like us. The goal was to chase the people who were behind 9/11. And someone could say, well, we did that. Osama bin Laden is dead. Mullah Omar is dead. Well, we didn't kill him, but he's dead. The person who was the successor of Mullah Omar is dead. So couldn't we say, as Bush said, that, well, mission accomplished?
No, absolutely not. I think you're taking the best interpretation of the goal of the mission as most Americans understood it. And it was a reasonable goal at the time, which was in the wake of 9/11 to go after the country or the regime that was host to Osama bin Laden and the rest of Al-Qaeda, having plotted the attacks. And that was a legitimate goal to take. But I think that, and I think it was what most Americans wanted their government to do, that was not really the goal of the operation. And I think this is one of the things that I think it's important for people to go back and revisit. The actual goals were far from clear at the very outset. They were a mixture of things that were legitimate, like what we're talking about, which was bringing justice to the sponsors of the Al-Qaeda team. But it was also things like, we're going to remake Afghanistan. I think that was there from the very beginning. And if you look at some of George W. Bush's speeches, including some of his very high profile speeches, including State of the Union, by the time January rolls around, it was a very definite goal that America was going to the Middle East, not only for the defensible goal of eliminating the threat that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda posed, but to bring elections and to bring reconstruction and to remake Afghanistan. And then later it became Iraq and other parts of the Middle East. And we were told there would be a tidal wave of democratization in the Middle East. So taking the actual goals as they were stated, then there was an unachievable goal. It was irrational and completely contrary to American interests. And there was no way to achieve that goal. It was a fantasy. Now, just to the concrete question you said, well, we went in and we seemed to topple the Taliban in 2001, and how is it they're back? I'm just summarizing your question. You can rephrase it if you don't think it's fair. That is not actually what happened. It's sort of a headline level history, which misses a lot of the details. It is true that the Taliban regime fell from power very quickly once America arrived in Afghanistan, and that's all to the credit of the American armed forces. The reality is that the goal in that context, at minimum, should have been to completely destroy that regime and to completely capture or kill all the Al-Qaeda forces in the area. None of that was done. The regime was toppled, but they were just scattered. A lot of them were killed, and you mentioned some of them, not all of them at our hands necessarily, but they were let to go free across the border, and many of them holed up in the Afghanistan Badlands there. And of course, you mentioned Osama bin Laden. It was 10 years before he was found and brought to justice, and he was living under our noses and under the nose of our supposed ally, Pakistan, for goodness knows how long. until American forces went into his compound where he was living so tranquilly, not really afraid of us as far as I can tell. So I don't think any of those details are really true. So the fighters left, and when within a few years, they regrouped, and by 2006, it was obvious that the Taliban were back on path to reconquer various parts of the country. So just on that question of was the minimum goal that many people could sign on to achieved? Well, no, because as many of the Taliban who were killed, many of them survived, and many recruited, and many joined. And this is a critical part that it doesn't get a lot of attention. You can look at different parts of the last 20 years of America's time in Afghanistan, and there are fascinating accounts of interviews and debriefings with captured Taliban fighters. And this is 10 years into the war, longer. And they're interviewed and they say, well, what are you doing? Why are you still fighting? There's many more Americans here, coalition forces. And their attitude, these captured fighters, their attitude was, well, we're going to win. We're just going to grind you down because we believe that our cause is worth fighting for. And that's the critical part of what you would have to do in any war, which is not just militarily and physically deprive the enemy of the means to attack you, or take their weapons and take their explosives. All of that is a necessary step, and you would want to do that. But what is essential is to defeat them. And that is a psychological, intellectual issue in the sense that they need to give up the goal. They need to give up their idea on their cause. And that was never done. That wasn't even part of the agenda. The agenda was to leave Afghanistan in as unaffected a manner so that it could be reconstructed. And that was the term we heard from the Bush administration. So there was no sense in which we were going to demonstrate by force that the cause of the Islamist movement was a lost cause. And I mean, there's so many things to say that it was not even, I'm characterizing it as the Islamist totalitarian movement. There's so little understanding of what this enemy is at the beginning of this 20-year cycle. And even today, there was such evasion of who they were and what they were about. So I challenge the premise of the question. From top to bottom, there was no sense of what the goal should have been, and nothing like what we needed to do to accomplish it.
So, Mark.
No, okay. So why is that? Why are we so hesitant to take the war to them the way it needs to be taken to them, which seems to be complete annihilation until they say uncle, and they surrender on our terms, not theirs. What's making us go down this route over and over and over again, not just in this particular history, but it seems throughout?
I think there are at least two important parts to the answer, and they're both philosophical. So one part of the answer is, if you look at the way America has tried to understand the enemy, so right after 9/11, and even before that, so the way Al-Qaeda was understood by various administrations, and then since 9/11, there was a monumental effort to not see the facts. So this is what Ayn Rand would call evasion, which is to deliberately not tell yourself the truth because you're uncomfortable with it. You want to tell yourself something other than the truth. You don't really want to understand what's going on. And I think this was a central part of the Bush administration's failure, which was they're not really applying Islam. They're just evildoers. They're hijacking a noble religion. They're bad people who are telling everyone that they're true to Islam, but our president knows Islam better than they do, apparently, and he insists that that's not true, and we're supposed to believe that. So there was this unwillingness to believe that any religion, and specifically Islam, could be the source of violence. And that is an ahistorical and completely false perspective. But many Americans clung to this, and the Bush administration in particular clung to this idea. But it can't possibly be true that these are really people living out and a totalitarian application of Islam. And so you get this massive evasion of who they are, and therefore what it would take to defeat them. And that's the second part of this problem. What it would take to defeat them is, you characterize it as total annihilation. You probably don't have to go that far, but you might have to go that far. What you need to do, I was suggesting a moment ago, is convince them that the goal that they hold dear and they believe is realizable is not achievable. And that might require a lot of military force. It might require less military force. It's elastic. You have to really judge that depending on what you're seeing. But and here is another way in which a philosophic idea really crippled us and why we didn't do what we needed to do. So in order to be willing to take all necessary steps to defeat your enemy, you need to understand who it is, but you also need to believe you have a moral right to defend yourself. So if you're facing, and I think this was exactly right, we're acting in self-defense, and we are entitled to live without the threat of Al-Qaeda, and we're entitled to live without the threat of looming other Islamist attacks from various sources. And that justifies us in retaliating against the Taliban and retaliating against Al-Qaeda and uprooting the whole movement of which they are constituent parts. All of that comes from a view that our lives are worth having, are worth protecting, and we're entitled to live free of all these foreign aggressions and menaces. But that's not something that our military and political leaders feel comfortable telling themselves. Like, it is really, what that means is you have to really value yourself. And I think what we found in the years since 9/11, and just at that moment, is that America lacks that moral confidence, and that you can think of it as the lack of self-esteem, but it's not psychological. Essentially, it's a real lack of self-valuing in a moral sense. And what is the source of that lack? What is undermined it? Because if you think America is not a terrible place to live, I came here as an immigrant because I wanted to live here. It's a wonderful place, even if it has many flaws and things that you could criticize, and I do all the time. The source of this lack is the prevailing moral view that no one is good unless they're doing something for other people. No one is good, and you can't even really claim to be good even if you're doing that. So it's this whole idea of altruistic service to others, and you're never ever achieving the good unless you're Jesus crucifying and dying on the cross. So there's really an unrealizable moral ideal that many people accept that destroys any sense of self-worth. And at the end of the day, even in the face of people who are coming and flying planes into buildings, who are seeking to destroy American lives at every opportunity, even at the cost of their own lives, as suicide bombers, what we found is that America's intellectual leadership and political leadership don't have the moral confidence that many Americans, I think, do. If you found an American and you said to him, should we go after these enemies and destroy them? Many people will say yes. But I think we have this gap where not enough people in cultural leadership have that moral sense. And I think we've been undermined by the prevailing moral ideas that tell us we're nothing unless we're doing something for other people. So therefore you see operations to bring freedom to the Middle East and Bush's whole democracy crusade. And I'm using that as a disparaging term. It was called the forward strategy of freedom, which is a fraud. And I don't like to use that term. But the whole attempt at bringing democracy was a way to manifest or to implement this moral ideal that, yeah, we can only go to the Middle East and destroy our enemies. We can't really destroy our enemies, but we can only go to the Middle East if we're doing something to lift the poor and oppressed in the Middle East. And by doing that, and this was part of the Bush administration's story, only if we do that can we then achieve something like security. So our security depends on their freedom. And that's just not true. It's a story that we told ourselves because of the way we think morality works. That in order to take action in self-defense, we had to wrap it in this packaging that we could tell ourselves, well, we're doing something for other people primarily. And if we're able to defeat, I'm not even going to use that word. If we're able to go after these people in some way that we think we're doing something, that's how we can justify the action. So in at least two fundamental ways, neither understanding what this enemy is and what it would take to destroy it, it's the whole evasion of who they are. And then secondly, the whole moral dimension of what are we willing to do. And Mark, on this, one of the points I make when I often give talks about this issue in the years past is I characterize the movie Zero Dark 30? I'm sure you've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the most powerful scenes in that movie is the dramatization. So this is the movie about the CIA and all the intelligence efforts to find Osama bin Laden in the years since 9/11. It's quite a thrilling movie. But the thing that I bring this up for is that the scene where Navy SEALs get into Osama bin Laden's compound. And that whole, just how they go after it, the level of precision, the way they fly in under cover of radar, the whole operation is just, it's inspiring. And if you've read the actual accounts and how well they do their jobs. So these are the people trained to the highest levels with the best equipment. And what it reminds you of is that our military knows what to do. If they need to take an operation, they know how to succeed. And we saw that in a very small way in the case of going after Osama bin Laden. It was just, for anyone who hasn't seen the movie or hasn't read about this, look it up, Google how this was executed. It is just a precision operation that inspires awe. And I'm not someone who's interested in military in that level of detail. And the contrast I would draw here is with the way in which our military was directed to operate in the Afghanistan. We can also talk about Iraq. Nothing like that level of execution was possible to them because they were constricted by rules of engagement and by priorities set by their political and civil leadership. That meant our military was sent into battle without the freedom to do what was necessary to win. And this is another reflection of the way in which moral ideas shaped the response to 9/11, the foreign policy, and even the battlefield conduct. And this is, so Nikos mentioned the books I've worked on. We have a new book coming out, and it's out today, actually. It's the second edition of Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism. And in that, there's numerous essays where we illustrate the ways in which irrational, and basically the moral ideas most people accept today, but they're irrational. People need to recognize that those ideas have subverted our response from top to bottom, from the way we think of the goal to the way we direct the military and to the way in which we let them act on the battlefield. And the contrast is, and I want to stress this, I don't think it's right to think of the failure of the Afghanistan war as a primarily military failure, because I'm convinced our military, left to do what it knows how to do well, could have succeeded readily and handily. And we saw that, a glimpse of that in the first days when they toppled the Taliban regime. But then they were told you can only go after them if you're being compassionate, if you're showing civilians a great deal of concern and protection. And obviously nobody invites civilian casualties. I don't think there's any benefit to that in most conflicts. But the issue then became that was the red line that they couldn't go past. And that really, there was a concrete way in which the war was hampered at that level, just at the combat level.
Can I push back a bit, Elan, on this?
Yeah, for sure.
I don't want to sound like an armchair general, but what could have been done differently in a country where there is no central authority, where you cannot tactically nuke the mountain? So for example, the Soviets didn't have rules of engagement. The Soviets, I mean, in the Soviet-Afghan war, they didn't recognize between civilians and combatants. But because of the nature of the country, of the fact that you haven't got an organized army, you basically have tribesmen in the mountains. That's why when they defeated the Soviets, for many years, it was basically anarchy because the one tribe was fighting the other till the Taliban's reconciliated power. So the question is, what could have been done differently in terms of how would victory in Afghanistan look like? Would it look like suddenly you've persuaded all these people that our way of life is better, or would you have local police or local regime, let's say, representatives in every village, in every mountain, where these villages are not even in the map? So how would victory look like on a more tactical level?
Sure. So I will qualify that this is not where I have a great deal of expertise, but I'll say two things that I think will go toward answering your question. I think one of them is to recognize that the way to defeat an enemy is to defeat the idea that their cause is worth fighting for. And that requires not just Afghanistan. That requires addressing the fundamental nature of this enemy, which is it's an Islamist movement which comprises not just the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but also Iran and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and other regimes that support this idea. And so I think it's good to step back and say, Afghanistan was a legitimate and defensible first step, but I don't think the solution can begin and end in Afghanistan. So that's one thing to say. The second thing about sort of at the tactical level, again, I'm not a tactical expert, but here are a couple of things that I think would have made a big difference, and they would have been possible absent the kind of constraints I'm describing. So when you topple the government, don't let everyone escape. And we knew that they were escaping, and this was not we saw where they were going. We let them do it because we were worried about civilian casualties. And I think there are other criticisms to make about what happened under the Soviets, but I don't think the Soviets were really in there to win. That's one thing to say. The other kind of thing you can do is prevent them from finding safe haven in the lawless area of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which our supposed ally, Pakistan, let them do. And so what you see, just as this is another scandal that hasn't gotten attention enough, as soon as all these fighters get into that area, they find safe haven because the Pakistanis don't care what happens there and they turn a blind eye. And they're supportive. A lot of them are really supportive of the Taliban, to the point where for a number of years after 9/11, the Taliban leaders were walking around cities in Pakistan. That was their shadow government. They were just in exile in effect. And we let the Pakistanis tell us a story that they're our friends. And we spent a lot of money giving them aid to go after the Taliban, even as the Taliban were living in freedom in Pakistan. Now, that is a big problem that you can solve. And if you solve that, you diminish their ability to fight, you diminish their ability to escape. And you're right, there are really questions of how do you control a country that is so dispersed, doesn't have real infrastructure and so on. But I don't think that's sort of the insuperable problem here. I think the insuperable problem is you need to recognize what it would look like on a grand scale to make the Islamist cause a lost cause, fundamentally. And there's more to it, obviously. It's not just Afghanistan. And the second thing is there are obvious military things that you don't let happen. You don't divert your military to reconstruction when the enemy is just running around shooting you. You don't tell your military, okay, don't go into those, don't bomb these 10 sites because we're here to reconstruct the country. When you know that as soon as you make a list and the enemy can go and hide in those places, you're giving them an advantage. So there are a lot of things like that I think would have made things different. But it's good to get both the macro level of what needs to happen and also these tactical things.
So we're running out of time, but we have a couple of questions, super chats from our audience. So let's give priority to that in the last 3 minutes. So Emiliano, I'll start with your question because it's difficult to answer from a principal point of view. What will be the diplomatic status of Afghanistan now? Which governments recognize the Taliban government? So we discussed this a bit off air. It's probably going to be, I think the Chinese have showed some interest in having some relationship with them. I don't know what's going to be the situation with Turkey because they had shown some interest in policing the airport before this. So Elan, do you think that the Taliban government will be, let's say, a quote, legitimate government in the eyes of the quote international community?
I expect there will be governments that recognize it to some degree. I mean, that was true in the 1990s before the US came. I think there were 3 countries that recognized the original Taliban regime. So I would not be surprised. And I think you mentioned China before we went on air. I think that's not, I think I would not be surprised if that happened. But the important thing, and I think everyone watching, the important thing, and this is for people to think about and for them to talk about with their friends and their associates and when they're online, the fact that the UN or some number of countries recognize some regime certainly does not make it legitimate. The fundamental issue is that the Taliban are murderous. And they are after totalitarian control. So the Soviet Union had numerous countries recognizing it. That did not change anything. It did not change its fundamental character. And that's what I think is important, is to evaluate them morally and recognize there is no sense in which they could be a legitimate government. Like the idea of imposing Islamic law as a totalitarian system, it should be beyond the pale for every country. And I think every country that does recognize them should be judged harshly for that decision.
And there's also a question on just war theory. We have 1 minute, so I realize, I think there's a whole chapter in Winning the Unwinnable War on just war theory, but very quickly for our friend who asked the question, how does this relate to what we described? So just war theory as a dogma, let's say, in the US Army.
Yeah, just war theory is a tradition in the study of the morality of war. and it's the dominant tradition. It basically, the way I would summarize it is, it implements the idea of selflessness as a moral idea and tries to build guidelines for how to conduct war so that you're complying with this idea of selflessness. And the argument in the chapter, which I recommend people who are curious to take a look, and you can find that chapter online too if you can't get a hold of the book, is that it's contradictory. It contradicts the basic goals of American self-interest, or the self-interest of any free country trying to defend itself, any country that protects individual rights, that tries to live up to just war theory. And this is true across the board. It's self-defeating, and it's undermining of that goal. So I highly encourage people to go explore that.
Good. So again, today's going to be a short episode. Am I right, Elan, that in 35 minutes you are with Onkar in New Idea Live talking about this topic, but now with more time? And so people who want to watch this, go to Ayn Rand Institute's YouTube channel. Again, in 35 minutes, Elan and Onkar Ghate are going to have a discussion on how some of the same themes that we discuss here, but more at length. And of course, two people at a level of understanding of the principle, which is the highest level. So I encourage you to check this out. Also, as I said, check out Elan's What Justice Demands, America and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict.
And what's the new book? What's the new book, Elan?
Yeah, the new book.
Sure. The new book is Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism: What Went Wrong After 9/11. We've made the PDF of that available today, even though the print version is coming out in a few weeks. We thought it was important for people to be able to get their hands on. And you can find that at newideal.aynrand.org. I encourage people to take a look at our journal where we publish that.
Excellent.
Thank you for having me.
Elan, thanks so much.
Thank you.
We're going to let you go. And people, we're going to see you tomorrow. And we're going to Clubhouse now with Mark. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.